If you've been watching my channel, you know that I am on a never-ending search for a proper human diet, trying to rediscover what a proper human diet is. I think our ancestors in ancient times knew what a proper human diet was. And I think due to modern advertising and new modern paradigms, we've forgotten what a proper human diet is. And so I have a special guest today, Dr. Bill Schindler, who's also been on a very similar search. Dr. Schindler, welcome.
It is so great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Man, we've been trying to make this happen for months now, and your travel and my travel and all the family stuff, it's been a challenge, but you're finally here. Welcome. We're live today in our private group. Okay. And so if it's okay with you, I'd like to take some questions as they come up from our private group members. And then after that, we'll post this on YouTube for the whole world to learn from. And I don't mean that facetiously. I think that your body of knowledge is vital for anyone trying to figure out what should humans eat, how should they prepare what they eat, what should they avoid. And so without further ado, give us a brief background bio summary of what you've been up to and why we should care what you think.
Absolutely. So first off, thank you so much for having me. And I need to tell everybody here, the first, I've obviously known who you were for a long time, but the first time we met each other in person was in Denver at the Low Carb Denver conference, which was a fantastic conference. And I have to tell you that not only, sometimes, they say that, you should never meet your heroes in person sort of thing, but which is so many times been the case. But what was fantastic is you and I met, we had a lot of quality time together talking. I remember one particular night we were standing there at one of the receptions deep in a conversation about obviously something very important. And somebody came up out of nowhere to ask you a question about their own health, something they were struggling with. And you immediately stopped, turned around and gave them all of your attention. And not only was I impressed with the way that you dealt with them, but I learned a ton just listening to you engage with them. So it's truly special for me to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And yeah, people are always surprised when I do that sort of thing, but I thank you for that praise. But at the same time, I always want to reply, that's what a doctor's supposed to do.
Yeah.
But I feel like that doctors must so seldomly do that it's shocking when you see a doctor do that. So but that's kind of my job, and I take it pretty seriously. Now, tell us about your background, your training, first of all, so that we can kind of get a handle on where you're coming from.
So my background is really, really varied. I have a PhD in archaeology and anthropology. So the Dr. Bill Schindler part is I am not a medical doctor. I come at this from a completely different academic perspective, but I think a very useful one. The quick version, we can dive into all sorts of things as deep as you want later. I have been unhealthy because of the way that I've fed myself most of my life up until about 15 years ago, when I really started to gain my health. So I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with food for most of my life, spent that entire time searching all sorts of repertoires of information, looking for doctors and nutritionists and magazines and blog posts and everything that could help me. And I was an athlete this entire time, even though I was so unhealthy because of the way that I ate. I was a Division I wrestler for Ohio State. And probably the worst health that I experienced was as soon as I was finished competing and was no longer working out 3, sometimes 4 times a day. All the weight that I had as a child came back on with all sorts of metabolic disease, and I was miserable from a health perspective. But what I think is really important, and I'm excited to share with everybody today, is this entire time, 3 things were really happening in my life that helped me answer my own questions about the way to nourish my body. Number 1, my father had me in the woods hunting, fishing, and trapping my entire life, and there was that deep connection to not only him, but also to something special about direct acquisition of your food. The second thing was my mother and my grandmothers had me in the kitchen my entire life cooking. And the third thing, which is really where I think some of my expertise can help add some a voice to all this, is I'm an archaeologist. My entire academic career has been spent researching ancestral ways of creating technologies to actually process food and change our diets and nourish our bodies as we went through major evolutionary transformations over 3.5 million years. So all of this, when all of these parts of my life came together, when I really realized that the answers I've been searching for in muscle and fitness magazines and doctors and nutritionists and FDA reg, all these places where most people go and look, it weren't helping me. When I realized that direct, a really incredibly short food chain, direct acquisition of my food, hunting, gathering, foraging, fishing, trapping, all of that was part of the key. Cooking at home from scratch was part of the key. And a deep, true understanding of our ancestral dietary past was the third piece of this puzzle that I was able to transform my health, transform my family's health. And now we own and operate a nonprofit that's focused on teaching all of these skills and this information, continuing to do research called the Eastern Shore Food Lab. And also we have a restaurant called the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, where we put all of this into practice and we get to nourish the community as well.
I love that. And my upbringing is very similar to yours. I can remember many days wading the creek, fishing with my dad, and also learning how to swim in that creek under the bridge, hunting squirrel, hunting rabbit, hunting wild turkey, hunting raccoon, hunting deer, and then bringing that home and processing that. And I love how you use that word process. I think we need to talk about that and explain that, because many people don't understand. But bringing that home, processing it, and then Granny Berry cooking that up and us having a feast on something that was previously alive in the wild, just a few hours before that. And for many years during my academic years, Bill, I looked on my past as gauche, as lowly, like, real educated people don't hunt. That's just, low life redneck. I'm upbringing, I can't help that. And now I look back and I treasure that, because, as you said, it's experience in the way that humans have done it for millions of years. That's invaluable.
Absolutely.
And so I'll be passing those traits that I used to look on so negatively. I'll be passing on that cultural knowledge to my children as well. And so Beckett he's 4 years old now. Probably next year he'll get his first BB gun. And then in a few years, after that, he'll get his buck knife, and then he'll get his .22 rifle a few years later. And we're going to be out harvesting animals off the farm and then processing those animals so that we can eat them for the nourishment of our bodies. Now, let's talk about the word processing, because in many nutrition circles, processing food is a dirty word. But I love how you broke it down in your book, that every bite of food that every human ever ate, without exception, was processed to some degree. Some food must be processed in order to not be inflammatory, in order to even be edible. Other foods you can eat them with less processing, but you're not going to gain access to the vitamin and mineral content without some degree of processing. So walk us through this dirty word, processing food.
So I love your approach to the proper human diet, and I think that's exactly what we need to be looking for. One thing that's missing in some people's quest for this is they're always looking that, we are no longer wild animals. Humans have not been wild animals for actually about 3.5 million years. We began to self-domesticate ourselves when we started creating the first stone tools and other technologies. So we have to think about our relationship with food from a domesticated species level instead of a wild species. So when you look at wild animals have a digestive tract that's perfectly suited to the foods that they eat. So a cow can eat grass. They're supposed to eat grass, and then it goes through their rumen, and they chew it a certain way and ferment in their rumen, all these things that happen to allow them to gain access to that nutrition in the most efficient, safe, and a nutrient-dense way. Humans are different. The only food that I truly believe that humans are perfectly designed to consume is our mother's milk when we're infants. And then
when we're infants.
We're infants.
Yes.
When we begin to, just like so all mammals are designed obviously to consume their mother's milk when they're infants. When mammals they get weaned from their mothers, they lose the ability in almost all cases to efficiently and safely derive nutrition from that same milk. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be drinking milk as adults or eating dairy as adults. We'll get into that in a minute. But that does mean most of us lose the ability to do that in the most effective and safe way. Between
2/3 of humans to up to 3/4 of humans have lost the lactase
Yes.
ability to break down lactose, which is the main sugar in dairy. And that happens at about 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age for most people. And so a lot of people talk about, oh, I've got lactose intolerance, as if it's a disease. Right. When actually being lactose intolerant that's the native state. Every human used to be lactose intolerant. And I think it's either 4 or 5 different times anthropology has recorded a case, some in Africa, some in the far north, where humans have developed lactase persistence. It's developed independently multiple times. And so we know that it's most likely a beneficial adaptation, because it gives us, because there's a ton of nutrition in milk. Nobody's arguing that. Ton of nutrition in it. But fun fact for you, my training in undergrad was animal and mammalian biology. And so I've always been kind of aware of the comparative anatomy of different mammals, right? Mm-hmm. And so the only mammal, there are 2 mammals on the planet that retain some degree of lactase persistence. One is human beings, and we evolved that about 8,000-9,000 years ago. Guess there's one other species that has developed lactase persistence at about the same time, maybe 1,000 years after we did. Do you know which animal that is?
I'm going to guess it's a cat or a dog, but I don't know.
The dog. Yeah. Cat. All cats are still lactose intolerant. Okay. I've searched the veterinary literature. There's not a single instance of a cat with lactase persistence, but many dogs that evolved from European descent have some degree of lactase persistence and can digest lactose. Now, outside of that, there are no animals, right? Not just mammals, but no animals on the planet that utilize the nutrient-dense milk. Because, and you know, as an archaeologist, life always finds a way, right? And so, if drinking milk as an adult animal is good, right? As using that term, good, then there would be some weasel, some badger, some skunk, some raccoon, somewhere in the world that had developed the cultural skill and was passing it on to its offspring of how to sneak into a herd of wildebeest or cattle or whatever, and in the middle of the night and gently get some milk from the teat, right? There's not a documented case in the animal literature of that. There's only one animal that has been documented to get the nutrition from milk. And it's a bird in the UK called the blue tit. And the blue tit has been documented multiple times back in the days when they used to deliver the milk to your front porch with the aluminum thing on it. The blue tit learned how to poke a hole in the aluminum and then access the cream on top of the milk. They never drank the actual skim milk. They were too smart for that. But they would eat the cream off the top of the milk. And that's been documented several times. But outside of humans, dogs that evolved with humans, and the argument is made, did we domesticate them or did they domesticate us, or was it a co-domestication? And I think it was a co-domestication.
I agree.
In the blue tit in the UK, there is no other mammal or animal on planet Earth that is able to use the nutrient density of milk as an adult mammal or animal. Right. Blue tit is the only one, and the dog and the human. That's it. So that's my 2 cents worth from all my study.
Milk's a perfect sort of poster child for this whole conversation, because so one way that humans can obviously utilize milk as adults, right, food, is because of these independent genetic mutations that have occurred, like you said, in Africa and in parts of Europe. But the only thing that genetic mutation has allowed us is lactase persistence in adults. There's other things that happen, obviously, when we were infants. There's other enzymes we produce and other biological things that happen on our digestive tract that made that milk as nourishing as it can possibly be. We really focus on the lactase issue because when you're lactose intolerant, it's a huge big deal, obviously, and very sensual in so many different ways when it goes wrong. But here's a really good, but there's other things that can happen. The interesting thing, and I'd love to get to that later too. Hopefully we'll get to talk about Sardinia a little bit. But when we make cheese traditionally, we are actually replicating those natural biological processes that happened in our digestive tracts when we were infant humans or infant whatever mammals it happened to be. So the act of actually making, now this is traditional cheese. This isn't nasty Acme, whatever stuff. I mean, real traditional cheese.
Yeah.
You're replicating those biological processes that happen inside of our bodies to make this dairy as safe and nourishing as it can possibly be. And that's a very powerful thing. So to go back to your earlier part of this conversation, the question that you had, what about this food processing? Food processing is essential to take a raw material, overcome our physical limitations, and safely and efficiently access all the nutrition that's on the inside. So here's a great dairy example. As far as genetics are concerned, true, and it's very hard to define this, but in the anthropological literature, what they say is, true Irish population has almost, I don't even know how you would define that, but this is in the literature, has almost 100% lactase persistence, which really speaks to how strong of a role dairy has played for a very long time in Ireland in history and prehistory. Got it. That makes sense based on everything we just said. But here's a great example. Mongolia has almost zero lactase persistence as adults. However, in traditional Mongolian cuisine, dietary habits, has dairy all over it. The difference is actually all the dairy in traditional Mongolian diets is fermented. It's been through that biological process. So that's used quite a bit to show the power of food processing. You can actually overcome your physical limitations and safely and efficiently access nutrition and all sorts of things in order to have at it. So humans began when we started creating stone tools 3.5 million years ago, started cooking our food at around 2 million years ago, started hunting for our food at around 2 million years ago. There's some really big suggestions that fermenting our foods happened even earlier than that. But regardless, we have been processing our food for a very long time. And when we started processing our food, and even the power of a simple stone tool is transformative in our ability to overcome our limitations and access nutrients in an easier way.
Yes.
Our bodies and our brains got an influx of this incredible nutrition, and it supported body and brain growth. But at the same time, our guts didn't grow. In fact, our guts shrank in relative proportion to our bodies and our brains, which means we're doing an incredibly good job of using these technologies to get as much nutrition from our environment as possible. Yes. We are now in a place that I am convinced we cannot support these current bodies and these current brains, both of which require a massive amount of incredibly high quality nutrition to fuel. We cannot survive without the technologies in our diets. Now, for many people, including you, and I am as well, very, very animal based in our approach. Many people would say, well, heck, that's not true because you don't need technology when it comes to animals. And that is absolutely false. You do, because you cannot, in a very efficient way, take down animals and open them up with just our bare hands. And I know there's a carrier hypothesis, and humans can run down animals to death and under the right conditions, and it's been documented and it's true, it can happen. But if you watch what's happening there, you have 3 or 4 people under the perfect conditions. Perfect conditions meaning it hasn't rained in days. It's super, super hot. We push animals literally a marathon distance, 20-something miles away from camp, and take this animal down because we've run it down to death. But here we are with this massive animal. 3 people have exerted that much energy to get that far, and we still have to cut the animal up. We still have to bring it all the way back to camp. That's not efficient. We require technologies to take these animals down. Now, it is also true that animals' resources are the most nutrient-dense bioavailable resources on the planet. And I am of the mindset that even more so for the blood, the fat, and the organs, but regardless, you do not have to cook an animal to safely and efficiently derive a massive amount of nutrition out of that animal. True. Cooking and a couple things help a little bit breaking it down, but regardless, that's true. In the plant world is a different story. You want to safely and efficiently have access to the nutrients in plants, you have to do a massive amount of processing.
Absolutely. Now, let me ask you, let's define a term. You use the word technology, and I know a lot of people in modern society, they think this is technology, and it is technology. But I love how you put it in your book. Like a human, the first time a human being took 2 rocks and whacked them together, and one of the rocks broke, and then there was this razor sharp edge on that rock. That's technology. That was actually state-of-the-art technology.
Yes, it was.
At that moment. That was the most modern technology known to our ancestors at that moment. And that one technological breakthrough, it's exactly accurate to call it that. revolutionized the way we were able to access, because all of my vegan brothers and sisters on Twitter, they are correct. If you drop me or Bill Schindler out on the Serengeti and said, okay, doctor, run out there and grab a wildebeest and with your claws and then bite it and bring it down with your teeth and then rip it to shreds and eat it. If that were our only food option, we would both starve to death. 100% accurate. 100% accurate. The vegans are right. But that's not, we have technology. And now you said that 3.5 million years ago, we were using stone tools. And it really triggers me a little when people call them stone tools, because I think there's another noun that better describes them. And I think that would be weapons. Do you agree with that? Because I have never seen a 3.5 million year old stone rake or a stone shovel or a stone, something you would use on a tree. It's invariably, it is sharp edge rocks. And then we see on the bones, the evidence of them using those sharp rocks to get the fat, get the organs, probably get the blood, but that doesn't leave a good anthropological signature. You can't really see that in the fossil record, but absolutely taking the meat and the fat off the bones.
I actually, if you can give me less than a second, I have that tool, the real tool. Hold on a second.
Yes. And so all you guys realize that when you use the word technology, it currently means this.
Sorry about the delay.
It means this, and it currently means this. This is our modern technology, but what Dr. Schindler's holding, that used to be the literal state-of-the-art technology that the Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, that's the guy right there when he first did that.
This is a resin cast of the actual oldest stone tool ever found, stone weapon ever found. It dates to 3.3 million years ago and was found just west of Lake Turkana in Kenya. And it was this rock here. It was struck in this spot right there. And this is the piece that came off. This is the actual tool. We call it the Lemekwe tool because that's the name of the site. That edge at the time of its release, when it was first made, is 1 molecule thick. It at the time was the sharpest thing literally in the world. And even today, the sharpest physical object in the world is a stone tool that's made from obsidian. I'll find a piece in a second, which is, again, one molecule thick, and it is 500 times sharper than a surgical scalpel. In fact, all of my kids are brought into this world with stone scalpels I made out of the obsidian. Incredibly, incredibly sharp. So we're not talking about, a bunch of bumbling idiots 3.5 million years ago, like knocking around some sandstone rocks and trying to, this thing was razor sharp. In fact, I would suggest, because I know people don't sharpen their knives right in their kitchens, this tool is sharper than just about anybody's knife in their kitchen listening to this today. That's
definitely sharper than my knives. Definitely. Now, I'm assuming you use the obsidian knife to sever the umbilical cord, not to perform a C-section on your sweet wife.
Now, listen, if we have a second to go down this rabbit hole, we had permission to do the entire C-section with the stone tool. I had made them. They were autoclaved. They were all ready to go. And we met with the same doctor the entire pregnancy. This is our oldest daughter. This is 20 years ago. And the last minute, they thought there was something wrong by one of the ultrasounds. And they did sort of an emergency C-section. So the doctor was different. But I had my scrubs on, the dad hat and all this comes in. And I walk in holding my autoclaved obsidian blades. And the doctor, it's the first time I saw the doctor. He says, "What the heck is this?" I said, "Oh, this is what you're going to do the C-section with." And he goes, "I have no idea what the hell you're talking about." And my wife's laid out on the thing, and she's got everybody attending to her. And I said, "No, I'm an archaeologist. This is really, really important to me." We went back and forth a few times, and finally he looked at me. He says, "Son," and he was probably like 10 years older than me. We go, "Son, look over there at your wife." And I looked at my wife with a big belly and my daughters, and he says, "Is this really that important to you right now, or is that really that important?" Right. I said, "Well, that's really important, because I'll tell you what, I'll let you cut the cords." I said, "Okay." And he said, "But I'm telling you right now, I've had fathers twice the size of you with their special scissors cut the cords, and they have a hard time. That rock isn't going to do a thing." And I said, "Okay, watch." And anyhow, our daughter was born. Her cord was like that big. Everybody runs over, and I use that blade, cut it like warm butter. And he actually asked me to make him a set of tools for his office just to hang up on his wall after seeing it. Fantastic. But your weapon thing is a very good point. The interesting thing at 3.5 million years ago is prior to this moment, all the food that was in our ancestors' diets were literally wild, hyper seasonal, hyper local, wild vegetables, which mean wild fruits and vegetables, which means, first of all, it's not like, and I don't want people to think like you walk into the produce section of the grocery store and you've like stepped back in time 4 million years. It wasn't like that, right? Because we have no seasons in the grocery store. We have no geographic boundaries in the grocery store. That stuff's coming from all over the world, all times of the year. So the wild fruits and vegetables that were consumed were a very limited amount because they had to, first of all, be low enough in toxin. They weren't processing any vegetables. It had to be in their location at the right time of the year that it was ready to eat. So it was very limited in scope, and a whole bunch of insects, which I know is a whole other topic, but we were definitely eating insects at that time were the most nutrient dense bioavailable food.
Yes.
And available year round, just like animal resources. So anyhow, when this is introduced into our toolkit as the first tool, this allowed our ancestors to butcher, scavenge carcasses that were killed by another animal, by another predator. So we don't think they were eating a whole bunch of blood and fat and organs at that time, because that stuff is typically consumed first by a predator that took the animal down. They're consuming the flesh that's left over on this, huge animal after the predator gorged themselves on the good stuff, went off to sleep, and then gives you a period of relative safety to run in with a tool like this and hack off pieces of meat.
Yeah.
At about 2 million years ago, we see the first evidence that suggests that our ancestors were hunting, and that was transformative. So I would suggest at that time, so this is kind of like a scavenging, butchering tool. The next set would be weapons of massive hunting capability that allowed our ancestors to become that apex predator, which provided them access to any part of that animal that they wanted. Not only the flesh, but the blood, the fat of the organs as well.
Yeah, but I would opine, and I obviously don't have evidence to support this, but I would opine that our grandfather back 3.5 million years ago would not have dulled his Stone Age digging up tubers with it.
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that, and one is, there's so many people now in this plant world that are like, oh my gosh, you have all these, calorie-rich, starch-rich, we call them underground storage organs, roots and corms and tubers, potato-like structures. This must have been such an important component of our diets in the past and historically. Almost all of them are so heavily guarded with chemical toxins that it is completely unbelievable to even consider this. In fact, one of the things I learned in Mr. Schumann's class in eighth grade history class, when the early explorers came to the New World, they encountered between 300 and 500 different types of potatoes under domestication, which is 100% true. But what Mr. Schumann didn't tell me, or anybody in the class, is that almost every one of them would have killed me if I ate it without some sort of processing. Yep. And a lot of those toxins carry over into the grocery store, a lot of the potatoes that are there as well.
Absolutely. And so I think your analogy with the produce section of the modern grocery store is very adequate. And I was having a conversation recently with a good friend of mine, Dr. Paul Saladino, and he was unaware. He was talking about eating papaya and mango out of the jungles of Costa Rica. And I said, you realize that they have been absolutely domesticated and crossbred. He's like, no, I'm talking about out in the jungle. I was like, yeah, dude, every plant on the planet, except maybe Antarctica, has been messed with by human beings in the deepest, darkest jungle, on every plain, every savanna. Human beings, we are the ultimate tinkerers. And I've read multiple studies in anthropology when they actually look at the DNA of the plant. They're like, oh my God, yeah, we absolutely mucked around with the mangoes and the papayas and the guavas out in the rainforest in the jungle. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I don't know of a single edible fruit on the planet that's been found that's like, nope, this is pristine and completely wild. It's never been crossbred. There's no genetic evidence that this has been messed with. I'm sure there's one out there, but any fruit that we eat in any quantity, any of the modern hunter-gatherer tribes, the fruit that they're eating, the tubers they're eating, have absolutely been selectively bred, in most cases, for thousands of years. And a lot of people are not aware of that kind of stuff. They think, oh, no, all that stuff was just out there. No, we've monkeyed with all of it. We've tinkered with all of it. Monkeying being a very apt term, I think. But there's quite a bit of evidence that if you go out into the deepest jungle and pick a big fat whatever, that's been crossbred by your ancestors hundreds of times for thousands of years.
The other thing I think people need to realize as well, especially people that are looking at, Paul obviously has started to put fruit into his diet, more than he used to. And fruit has been in our diet for a very, very long time. It's not that it hasn't been, but a couple things that people need to recognize. One is certainly, fruits, especially the stuff at the grocery store, have been, dramatically transformed from their wild counterpart, from the stuff that when we say our ancestors were eating fruit 3 million years ago, that is a completely different food than the fruit that's in the grocery store, because we're breeding now for reasons other than our own health, but mostly to satisfy our sort of hedonistic urges like sugar content or, breeding things to have no seeds. So it's easier for us to eat the watermelon and not spit them or whatever it is.
Flavor and appearance.
Absolutely. But the other thing I think everyone needs to recognize is, and this is true in the plant world in general, and I'm not going to go so far as to say, and I say this all the time anymore, Anthony Shafee is a very good friend of mine, and he's this idea that plants are trying to kill us. And he really has, some really solid foundational evidence for a lot of this. I want to slightly transform that statement, because I think plants are incredibly dangerous if they're not processed the right way. And some are just incredibly dangerous. We can't process the toxins out of them anyhow. I don't think they're trying to kill us, but they're just trying to survive.
They're trying to protect themselves.
To protect themselves. But their main purpose, and one thing that gets lost, I think, in this, the plants are just truly evil scenario, is that plants produce something called allelochemicals, which allow them to interact with the outside world. Most of them are protective mechanisms that keep fungus and bacteria and disease and predators and away so that they can reproduce viable offspring. But some of these allelochemicals actually attract. So, there are parts of plants that require intervention for them to work properly. So pollinating plants often require pollinators. So flowers, for example, look beautiful, smell beautiful, and believe it or not, are usually low or no toxins loads, because they're attracting pollinating, things to pollinate and navigate within there and move the pollen around and that sort of thing. But fruits are another great example. Fruits, the purpose of a fruit is to look, smell, and taste delicious when the seeds are ripe, so that an animal will come, eat it, and then deposit the seeds in a pile of manure somewhere else, right? It is literally a reproductive mechanism. So ripe fruits are rarely, they can be, but are rarely toxic. But unripe fruits are often toxic. And the reason is because the plant does not want that seed to be spread until that seed's ready to be spread, until it's reached its maturation level to allow it to germinate somewhere else. So things like, if anybody's eaten a pawpaw, an unripe pawpaw will give you massive diarrhea. And or an unripe persimmon will make you pucker. And the first time I ate an unripe persimmon was probably 25 years ago. And I literally remember that moment because it was such. But a ripe persimmon is one of my favorite fruits on the planet.
Absolutely.
And that is intentional on the plant's part. So I know there's a lot of people now. I just did a blog post recently about bananas. And there's a lot of people eating unripe bananas because the sugar content isn't as high now. But there actually is a toxin load that's there in an unripe banana that is not there in a ripe banana. And we start trying to monkey with our carb and do this and trying to, shortcut some of these natural mechanisms, and we can get ourselves into trouble.
I totally agree. And I'll make a confession here. When I first started this proper human diet thing, started keto, low carb, paleo, primal, I thought it was all about the daily carbohydrate intake. Mm-hmm. But I thought if you get the carbs low enough, then it doesn't matter. You can eat anything. And now I realized I was incorrect about that. The carbs, for many people who fatten easily, develop prediabetes easily, metabolic syndrome easily, they are absolutely, you got to keep the carbs very, very low. Mm-hmm. But the second thing is the inflammatory potential of the food you're about to eat. And some people can eat unripe bananas all day long, and they don't seemingly have any reaction or problem. I don't know of anybody that can eat an unripe persimmon. That's correct. But I think in all human physiology, there's this normal distribution curve where some people, just like the people that develop lactase persistence, right? There were a few people that had enough genetic variation. They were able to tolerate it okay. Mm-hmm. Some people, if they eat too much, it's going to cause a problem. Some people, if they even look at this unripe fruit or this vegetable that's been unprocessed, they're going to have a huge reaction to it, right? And so that sounds like a bad thing, but actually evolutionarily, that's a very good thing, because it gives us these subgroups of the tribe, right? Mm-hmm. Who somebody can try that and be like, oh, I can get by on that. But this guy, if he tries it, he's going to be sick for 3 days. He can't touch it. But then that also gives us an avenue of evolution in case times get tight with this other source. We can all just reproduce out of this guy who was able to tolerate the unripe banana, right? And so there's all these facets of this that become more or less important depending on how you're talking about it. We actually have an example of the fruit, and when Dr. Schindler says the fruit is delicious, he means that relatively speaking, okay? Because the fruits thousands of years ago, none of us would have found them delicious, almost without exception. Here in Tennessee, we have something called a summer grape. A lot of the locals call it a possum grape. They're very tiny, got a big seed in them, and they're sour. Sour's not a strong enough word, but to possums, they are delicious. And possums will gorge on them, and they eat the seed and all, but they don't destroy the seed. So it's a great example of what you were talking about. So the possum eats these possum grapes, and then they go around pooping out the seeds everywhere, spreading the seeds that probably actually germinate better once they've been through the digestive system of the possum, right? But I've tried to eat them even as a boy. I love warheads and all the sour candy. Possum grapes, no sir. You can make decent jelly if you put about 2 cups of sugar per 1 ounce of the grapes, but otherwise inedible to humans. I'd have to be starving to death before I could eat them, and they'd probably give me the shits if I tried. So it's just no way. But for other animals, they are delicious, and that's how these different fruits evolve this ability to allow their seeds to be eaten. Right. And pass through, and then they wind up in a dung pile, which is perfect fertilizer. So now you've got a new possum grape growing over there a half mile from where that grape was actually at.
And the other, I think, important part of that conversation with plants. So real quick, let me just say one other thing about our ancestral approach to things from the plant world and things from the animal world from a technological perspective. Prior to the agricultural revolution, right? So prior to 10 to 12,000 years ago, where we're still hunter-gatherers, consuming both plants and animals, if we look at our technological inputs, there's a very stark contrast between how we include animals in our diets and how we include plants in our diets. Again, prior to the agricultural revolution, almost every single technological advancement that allowed us to include animals in our diet were created to overcome our physical limitations and allow us to get that animal, right? So, things like spears and atlatls and bows and arrows and throwing sticks and nets and fishing hooks and traps and all those sorts of things that allow us to capture that animal. Almost all the technologies required to include animals in our diet were focused on getting the animal. Once we have that animal, all you need is a sharp edge like this to cut it open. And other than maybe a little bit of release of nutrients in meat, raw red meat by a little bit of cooking, you don't need to do anything. You can cook it, sure, you can do anything, but you just need to get into that animal. You're good to go. You have to get the animal. But plants are the exact opposite. So getting plants is incredibly easy to do. It's time consuming, but we don't need a whole lot of technologies to do it. Most foraging is collective foraging, other than maybe a digging stick to get at some roots and tubers. You're picking berries, you're picking leaves, you're picking stalks, you're picking fruits. But almost all the technologies our ancestors created to include plants in our diet were focused on accomplishing 2 main things: making those plants safe to eat, so getting rid of their toxins, and or making the nutrients that they have available to our bodies. Because plants have nutrients, sure, but in most cases, in all cases, it takes a lot of work to get the nutrients. In many cases, it's impossible for our body, our human digestive tract, to access the nutrients in those plants without some sort of help. So including plants in our diet required a massive amount of technological input to make them safe and bioavailable. But including animals really just required us to get that animal. And then once we had it, we could cut it open. Agricultural revolution, everything changes, because then we have mechanized labor and plows and all sorts of things that require massive input. So I think that's a really interesting way when we think about what plants and animals, what it meant to have them in our diets in the past. That I think really helps frame the conversation really well. But the second thing that I want to, since we're talking about the fruits, is that so much of the plant consuming world is focused on seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes, right? And if you think about it, those are the babies of the plants.
That's
and
right.
that's where most of the chemical defenses are located. And here we are. So we made the great example of the possum eating the possum grape and then pooping out seeds are designed physically and chemically to withstand the digestive tract of animals that consume the fruits. And in many cases require passing through a digestive tract in order to actually germinate properly, like you mentioned earlier. And here we are spending all sorts of time and energy and effort trying to safely get nutrition out of these things that are, everything that they're doing is against us actually trying to safely derive and efficiently derive nutrition from. Seeds, nuts, grains, and legumes have to be processed in order for, and I'm not even saying they even should be in our diet, but if we're going to include them in our diet, we have to do things to them in order to not cause damage to us, and also to make sure we get some kind of nutrition from them.
Yep. And when we call a plant-based diet a modern diet, and I think that's exactly correct and proper to say that. But a lot of people don't mean what you and I mean by that, because what we're saying is that before 12,000 plus or minus years ago, we did not have the technology to harvest the nutrition from most plants. Now, some anthropologists say we started using fire on purpose to cook with 1 million years ago. Some say it was not that long ago. Some say it was longer. But that's definitely a technology we can use to open up the nutrition of plants. And indeed, there's a theory that that's why when our brain started to get so big. But I think anthropology is pretty clear that it happened before that. It has to be from the fat of the animals. But other than fire, that we really didn't have the technology. We didn't have the pots that we could sit on an open fire, because it's one thing to have a pot that you can put hot stones in. That's one thing. But then a pot that you can actually sit over the fire, that's a big technological breakthrough that we didn't make for many, many hundreds.
Oh, that's like pushing 10,000 years ago. I mean, it's not even nowhere near the time. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And so most people, when they say that a plant-based diet's a modern diet, they mean, oh, we've got to have shipping containers, and we got to have refrigeration, and we got to have all that. And they're correct about that in modern society, especially in cities. But even if looking at this from an archaeological, anthropological perspective, a plant-based diet is still a modern diet. We could not break down the poisons, the toxins that Dr. Schindler is talking about, but also unlock the nutrition. Those are two different things in the plants, because in many cases, the vitamins and minerals are locked up in the phytochemicals in the plant. And even though they're technically in there, so if you go to the USDA Food Data Central, it'll say there's this much iron or this much magnesium or this much manganese in whatever, but that doesn't mean that you can access it. And we see that a lot with beta carotene. A lot of vegans consider beta carotene vitamin A. Well, beta carotene is not vitamin A, and you can get tons of beta carotene from green plants and colorful plants. But many of us are very poor converters of beta carotene into retinol vitamin A. And so again, you've got this normal distribution curve. Some people, if they eat pounds of carrots and colorful vegetables and green vegetables, they can convert enough of the beta carotene to get enough vitamin A, but many people cannot do that. And so therefore, once again, you've got to have a certain level of technology to even entertain living on a plant-based diet.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, another fantastic example is niacin in maize or corn. Corn is the most widely grown grain in the world.
Yes.
It is the most difficult grain for the human body to fully digest. And the great example is, even anybody eating corn on the cob in the summer, the next morning you see corn in the toilet. And if you haven't seen it, it's because you haven't looked.
Yes.
And that's even an unripe kernel, right? And our body can't process that properly. But even if you have a fully mature grain of maize or corn and grind it into cornmeal, you don't see it the next day because it's all ground up, but there's a lot of nutrients that are in there that pass directly through your body. And
including vitamin B3. And I actually have my great-grandmother, Laura Bell Kibler, died of pellagra.
Really?
Yep.
Where?
Tennessee? She was in Virginia, married to my great-grandfather, Granddaddy Barry's mom and dad. And Granddaddy Barry was orphaned. She died when he was 8 or 9 years old. He had to go live with an aunt. And she had been in the mental institution a couple of times, had terrible skin, and she was diagnosed on her death certificate with pellagra. But that was back during the time when the doctors thought it was an infectious disease.
Yep.
There's actually a ton of research about it, but they were poor. He had a little sawmill, and she lived on a ground up corn diet.
What year was this? The 20s, 30s?
This was in the 30s, yeah.
Yeah.
And so even though the discovery was made, I think in the early 20s or late teens, you got to remember how society functions. It takes years back then, sometimes decades, for that new discovery to filter down through society and make it to my great-grandfather and great-grandmother's poor little Virginia farmstead. They didn't know, and she died of pellagra. It's on her birth certificate, and my life was changed forever because of that, because Granddaddy grew up an orphan living with relatives.
Mm-hmm.
That changed his life, which then he fathered my father differently because of that. And so people think, no, this is foolish talk. People can eat corn. It's fine. No, if you just try to live on ground up corn, you will literally die, and it will not be a pleasant death.
Absolutely, that's unbelievable. Yeah, they found. I think it was 1920s. They realized it had to do with corn. It was 1936, I believe, that there were 3 scientists that were studying an issue with dogs, malnourished dogs,
Yep.
that were able to put the link with niacin, and then that's why almost every baked good is fortified with niacin today.
Yeah,
but
it was considered a disease of filth because it was predominantly low socioeconomic classes that suffered from it, right? So all the upper mobile people were like, oh, it's just these rednecks, these hillbillies, they don't take a bath. And so the doctor that actually discovered it's vitamin B3, that's what it is. He used to have filth parties and to try to disprove this myth. And him and his wife, they would literally drink urine and eat poop. And they would have all these hors d'oeuvres, and they would invite people, come, we're going to have a filth party. And they would eat the filthiest things you can imagine, but then not develop pellagra. And they're like, see, shut up. It's not filth. It's not a filth disease. It's a vitamin deficiency. But it still took decades for that to be accepted. And it just didn't come in time to save my great-grandmother, Laura Bell. She died of it in her 20s.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. You're the first person I've met that has a direct link to somebody that
Makes me want to cry a little bit, even though I've never met her.
Yeah. But it really, I mean, that is such a profound example of the dangers of plants, especially when they're not processed properly.
Yes. And let's get Alyssa's question, and then we're going to talk about processing. So where do you think we crossed the line into ultra processing? Like, where should we have stopped all this processing business?
So the moment that I realized there was this issue with the word processing was I used to teach at Washington College. I taught there for 15 years, archaeology and anthropology, almost always food related in some way. But this one particular semester, I was teaching, one of the classes I was teaching was a prehistory class, and I know food and diet were, I don't remember what class it was, but that was part of it. And the other one was about the modern food system. And in this one semester, there was a student I had, a female student, that was in both of those classes at the same time. Right. So, and she came up to me halfway through the semester. She's like, Professor Schindler, listen, I don't understand. Like, you say food processing in the prehistoric class, and your smile is excited, and this is God's gift to whatever. And then you say food processing in the modern class, and you look like somebody ran over your dog. Like, what's the difference?
Right.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I know there's a difference, but you're the first person who's asked, and I had to think about it. And this is what I came to then, and this was years and years ago, but I think this is valid. Most of the food processing technologies that were invented over the past 3.5 million years by our ancestors. And what's fascinating is that almost every prehistoric technology has something to do with food. Getting food, processing food, storing food, sharing food, redistributing food, something. So it's very important. So think about it this way. Almost all the Albert Einsteins of all of our ancestors were creating things that had something to do with food. Yep. And their inventions and their technological inputs into our diets made our food system so incredible that it supported massive body and brain growth. And then here we are today as a product of 3.5 million years of all of this. Almost all of those technologies were focused on several very important things. creating safety, nutrient density, and bioavailability in our foods, period. Almost every single one of them.
Every Elon Musk for the last several million years, their discovery had something to do with getting better access to nutrition.
100%. And because of that, it supported this body and brain growth. And you and I are sitting here having this conversation on the backs of all of that foundational technologies that, in our diets. But then something changed. And some of it began at the agricultural revolution. A lot of it happened during the industrial revolution. And then it just hit the fast forward button, and it's been exponentially changing since then, where food processing technologies started focusing. And there were two issues. One is it started focusing on other things like uniformity or sugar content or the ability for things to ship really far distances. It was focused on making other people massive amounts of money.
Yep.
And not that that is necessarily an evil thing. What makes it evil and makes it really bad is that almost all of those were at the expense of safety, nutrient density, and/or bioavailability. So people are getting rich, and our food quality is going, into the toilet. And there's some extreme examples, like with the maize and the pellagra and all that, where that this one change in this one part of our food system has had devastating impact on the people that were eating it. And you can't say that about all the different pieces, but what you can say is that it's happening at every single part of our food system today. Sometimes in massive amounts, sometimes in little amounts, but they compound on one another. So no matter where you are, whether you're at the grocery store or at the dining hall or at the cafeteria at the hospital or even at the grocery store, our food has been negatively impacted. Think about, for 3.5 million years, our diets have been incrementally getting more nutrient dense, bioavailable, and safe. And as a result of that, literally, our species was created, right? 300,000 years ago, the first modern day Homo sapiens appeared with these massive bodies, these massive brains, require all sorts of nutrition because of these incremental changes in a very positive, amazing direction. And since 12,000 years ago, and more importantly, this fast forward button in the past several hundred years, it's been going downhill at every single place we turn around in our food system. Yeah. And we're feeling, and right now we have to have podcasts and we have to have conversations like this to start to try to put things on track.
We're the only species on the planet that has to have podcast discussions about what we should eat. No other species has the need to do that. They just know what to eat. And I think I love your definition of ultra processing, how it became a problem. And I think it was all about taste and appearance, right? Trying to hit the bliss point, the perfect amount of sugar, salt, and fat, so that because food turned into a commodity. I think that at some point that's in that. You can even see that in the corn, because if you can if you dry corn, grind it up, you can put that in a 50-pound bag, my friend, and you can put that on a riverboat, right? Or you can put that on the Erie Canal, or you can put it on a steamship and ship it anywhere. It's going to have a much longer shelf life. So it stops being food at that point. It starts being a commodity. And I think the commoditization of food, because any food that's looked at as a commodity, and that's all the grains, all the legumes, because they have a super long shelf life, they do contain nutrition, but often we can't get access to it. Absolutely. They can be shipped everywhere. They can be put on a store shelf. Go into that a little more. I think that's very important, a part of this, because food stopped being 100% about being nutrient dense, being nutritious, but being uninflammatory. It changed at some point. And I think it's when people realize, hey, I can make a bunch of money doing this new process I've invented of grinding up corn or grinding up, the wheat or whatever. But you can't do that. You can't turn real food into a shelf-stable, shippable commodity, in my opinion.
The other thing that's important to help answer this question too is, first off, I know I'm talking to your audience, which is already in an incredible mindset about all of these things. It doesn't need to be convinced at all any further about the evils of agriculture or agricultural revolution, but not the evils of agriculture, the evils of the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. But a fantastic article I urge everybody to read, it's only 3 or 4 pages long, is written by Jared Diamond, called "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race."
Yep.
And you can Google it; it'll come up. It's fantastic, but it helps
I'll
reframe.
put a link in the show notes for people on YouTube.
Yeah. But what happened at the beginning of the agricultural revolution that has been, I think, supporting all the changes to the point now we're at this ultra processed food system is that every step from that point to now has disconnected us further from our food system. So prior to 12,000 years ago, prior to the agricultural revolution, everybody at some level was involved in the acquisition or production of food. And the most you were away, distance from your food, was like one person in your family. Like your mother might have done it instead of you, or your father, or your sister, or whatever. But there were no questions about the food. Nobody had to ask questions because it was all right in front of you. When we hit the agricultural revolution, we go from from hunter-gatherers, right, to food producers. And again, Mr. Schumann's class, 8th grade, he was a fantastic teacher. I don't mean to pick on Mr. Schumann, but the way he taught the agricultural revolution, which is I think the way most of us learned about it, was this amazing thing that freed up sections of the population to pursue all sorts of things like politics or religion or poets or art, whatever. It's fantastic. But there's a negative consequence to this, right? So though people that were freed up from the food system were distanced from the food.
That's right. It also allowed dictators and kings and standing armies and invasions and sieges. It also allowed all those things to happen as well.
There's no evidence for did people kill each other in the past? Absolutely. We have evidence for it. There's no evidence for organized warfare prior to the agricultural revolution. Period. Yeah. And the advent of most diseases started when we started domesticating animals, right? Not all, but most of them. I mean, there's a lot of negative concept, but from the food perspective, we have a segment of the population that's getting more and more distanced from the food. The next biggest distancing happened in the Industrial Revolution, where we go from food producers to most of us just become food consumers, which is where we are today, like in an exponential way. Like most of us are at the tail end of this incredibly long food chain. And while some of us might view that as convenience and that we're empowered now to go buy anything we want, the reality is we're incredibly unempowered and and there's this veil, this wall between us and our food. And not only do most of us not grow our food or harvest our own food or cook our food, we don't know anybody involved in the process. We know the person that maybe stocks the shelves at the grocery store, and they don't know anything about where it came from.
Right. I think it makes us very ignorant, but it also makes us very fragile. Even as a modern society, I think that our society is much more fragile because nobody knows how to procure or prepare food. And if the trucks stop running, then who's in charge of the food? Because guess what? That'll become the number one issue real damn quick if the trucks ever stop running. And so I think that the ignorance should be obvious to everybody. But for many people, they don't get the fragility that puts modern society in. If something happens to the Iowa corn crop, millions of people will starve to death. People who don't live in Iowa, people who couldn't find Iowa on a map will starve to death because the Iowa corn crop didn't make this year. That's a real thing that can happen because of this agricultural revolution or devolution, I like to call it.
But it also makes us, like you said, dependent, but not just dependent on the food itself, but dependent on the information about the food. And that's very controlling. So they can ultra process to whatever degree and then tell us whatever we want. And they can put the newest study out about how red wine is good for us this week and it's going to kill us next week, or we should be eating this. And then we all try, because we don't have that own, inherent knowledge about our food and our food system, that all that information. So I do think part of the answer to Alyssa's question has to do with that control of information and this incredibly long food chain that allows that ultra processing to take place. Because I guarantee you, when people are making the decisions to further process and further process, if we truly all knew what was going on, we would have never allowed it to happen.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah. But we're here now. And so all we can do is sit around and talk about food and how we used to do it and try to get back to that. And I'll give you my example. And Bill and I have talked about this before. Nisha and I actually sold our house in the city and we moved back to the country, and we live on 40 acres now. And I've got sheep in the pasture. I've got chickens in the chicken coop. I've got quail in the quail hutch. And at some point in the future, Bill Schindler is going to come to OB Farms And it's mandatory. You have to bring your wife because Nisha has to meet her. She's going to love her. And we're going to process one of the sheep, maybe a chicken, using 3.5 million year old technology. And then we're going to cook it using million-year-old technology. And then we're going to eat it using hundreds of millions of year old technology.
Yes.
And video all of it for you guys to watch on the Farm Channel. That's going to happen one day. So you brought up beans and legumes earlier. And I think this is especially for our plant-based brothers and sisters. And I'm not a vegan basher, and I know you're not either. I think we're all bumping around in the dark trying to rediscover what is a proper human diet. And I say all the time on Twitter, I love it when somebody goes vegan because it means that at least they're thinking about their food.
I love
and
that.
When a human starts thinking about their food, it destroys the false paradigm that you were just talking about, where you're just like sheep going, oh no, we need coffee. No, coffee's bad. We need wine. No, eat eggs. No, don't eat eggs. And we're just like foolish sheep just being led to, I don't know what, what I lead sheep to and what you lead sheep to, but surely that's not happening, right? But when you start to think about food as a vegan, that's excellent. I love it when somebody goes vegan because I think that's the first step to adopting a meat-heavy, proper human diet. But that's where they're going to get to eventually. So beans and legumes, soybean, all the pea protein that's in all of these highly processed, ultra-processed things. Let's talk about beans and legumes and how they used to be processed. And I was raised with my grandmother. So I saw when she bought a bag of navy beans into the house, that was a 3-day process before we actually ate those beans. And most people think, no, you just cook them for a few minutes and they're fine to eat. Red beans, navy beans, white beans, all the beans. Talk about beans, educate us.
Yeah. So first off, please understand, everyone, that you need, I know a lot of people, probably everybody listening fell into that Christmas trap a couple of years ago, and everybody has an Instapot. Like everybody wanted to buy an Instapot. Everybody probably has an Instapot. One of the things that Instapot was shouting about was the fact that you could use that as a pressure cooker and actually cut down your grandmother's 3-day bean processing into just a couple hours. And you could actually pressure cook these dried beans and have them have the right texture and flavor in just a short period of time. And
again, flavor and appearance.
Yeah, flavor and appearance.
Yeah.
The reality is, if you ate a raw, this is how dangerous legumes are. If you ate 3 raw kidney beans, you would land in the hospital. It'd be hard to do it anyhow, but people have done it. People ended up in the hospital very, very, very sick. They are incredibly toxic. Beans, nuts, seeds, and legumes all have toxins in them. Some of them we can mitigate with work, some of the dangers of these plants. And again, I am not suggesting that we need to eat any of these things, but there are, and one of the things I do advocate a lot for is to realize that humans are incredibly complicated species. And in order to be fully nourished as a human, we need to do more than just meet our biological requirements. That's a long time ago. We are no longer a wild animal. Food is intertwined in just about everything that we do. Food is intertwined with politics, religion, socioeconomic status, romance, tradition, holiday, all of these things. And you can't separate the things out. So I do believe that when we have to look at the larger picture when we eat food, and we need to make sure that we're meeting or exceeding our biological, cultural, emotional, all of our needs in order to be fully nourished as humans. Sometimes for some people, that means they might be including some things in their diet that somebody else might not. But what we do need to understand is there is a safer way to include every one of those things than most of what's in the modern industrial food system. So beans, nuts, seeds, and legumes, if you're going to consume them, you have got to put them through processing. Legumes especially, they require soaking, a combination of soaking and cooking in order to detoxify them to the most amount that can be detoxified. You can't just cook them. It doesn't do it. It needs to be both. If you go to Ireland, even one generation back, anyone eating oats would have set out the oats, put them in either milk or water the night before and let them soak overnight. And overnight through that soaking, and there's a little bit of fermentation that takes place, they are a completely different food than taking those oats and cooking them right away. Here at the restaurant, we have very strict rules and regulations. Any seeds, nuts, grains, or legumes that we serve, first of all, they're on the lower end of the oxalate scale because you can't process oxalates out, but they are all processed in some way. So, for example, we do make peanut butter, make some things out of peanut. We take raw peanuts, we soak them overnight, then we dehydrate them, then we roast them, then we grind them, and to make our peanut butter.
Yep.
That's a completely different peanut butter than the Skippy jar, even 100% just peanut Skippy jar that you get at
I can promise all you guys watching this, Skippy and Jif do not do that.
Oh, no, hell no, they don't do that. But so the other thing about soaking, which is interesting, is, and I know we didn't get into the maize processing, the way to process maize that's thousands of years old that allows our body to access the niacin on the inside.
Go through that and then come back to the legumes. Yes,
okay,
yes.
So here's the crazy part of the story, the pellagra story, is that first of all, over several hundred years, we have documented examples of, in Europe and also back here in the Americas, especially in the early 20th century, of millions of people getting sick from pellagra and hundreds of thousands dying from pellagra. Yep. And remember, that's a niacin deficiency in the diet. It's happening when maize comes in, or corn, and all they're eating is corn. So all their nutrition is coming from that corn source, and they're getting sick and dying of pellagra, niacin deficiency. The part that we didn't mention earlier, which I think is the nail in the coffin, so to speak, is that corn has niacin in it. Corn actually has quite a bit of niacin in it. The problem is it's in a state called niacin, which our body can't access. There is a way to process it. It's called nixtamalization. We know the process is 4,000 years old. I think we're going to find out it's probably closer to 8,000 years old.
I totally agree, but there's no research to support that yet. But it's got to be open.
Yes, but it's forthcoming. But it allows the niacin to be. It changes the niacin into niacin, and then it's available to our bodies. It's the way the Native Americans processed maize for thousands of years. And it can still be done today. And in that word, nixtamalization is the word tamale. A real tamale is made this way. Real traditional tortillas are made this way. And it's just a great example of, for people, millions of people suffered, hundreds of thousands died from a deficiency in a nutrient while eating massive amounts of a food that contained that nutrient, and they were pooping it right out. It was going right through that's the power of the plant's defense mechanisms, but it's also the power of the right kind of processing.
Yeah. And the rednecks and the hillbillies in the southeastern United States, actually, I think it developed here. They would turn corn into hominy using lye, right? Which also breaks that, and so that you can have access to at least some of the niacin. And so even poor dumb rednecks and hillbillies figured out you don't just need to eat the corn. So they figured out another way using an alkaline substance. Same process.
And same process. So you can use potassium hydroxide, which is wood ash, which was originally used. Calcium hydroxide, which is cal. If you go to a Mexican grocery store, you can buy the white powder. It's called cal. It's also, if you go to Walmart and get pickling lime, it's the same thing. Yep. Or you can use sodium hydroxide, which is lye, to do very similar things throughout the different stages. But even grits, up until the Civil War, all grits were nixtamalized, and just for convenience purposes, after the Civil War, it kind of just went away, and now grits are just ground up corn, and the same thing's happening. This is a good, if people are listening, oh my God, corn and this, and they're getting scared. One thing to remember is pellagra becomes a problem when the mainstay of your diet is maize that's not processed properly.
Right.
If you're eating a little bit of corn here and you're eating all this other stuff and getting niacin in different places, it's not an issue. But that's not to say don't process maize properly if it's in your diet. That's why would you eat a food that has nutrition in it and not process it properly and poop the nutrition, have a lot of that nutrition.
Exactly. And then just like with dairy, it's not just about the vitamin B3 and the niacin and the vitamins. It's also about the inflammatory potential. Corn, a lot of people, everybody's heard of gluten and gliadin when it comes to wheat, but most people have never heard of zein, which is in corn. And it is an inflammatory gluten-like precursor in corn, and the processing of the corn also breaks down the zein, making the corn less inflammatory. And all of us know somebody that if they eat corn, they will get this stomach distension like they're 3 months pregnant.
Yep.
And that's that normal distribution curve. If some people can eat 10 pounds, no problem. Some people too much, it's a problem. Some people, if they touch it, it's a problem. And the using the alkaline substance, whether the lye or the cal or whatever, also breaks down the zen. So it makes the corn less inflammatory, so a larger percentage of the population can ingest it and not have inflammation. And a lot of people say, well, it's just these few people who can't eat corn. I disagree. I think it's just these few people who have the noticeable reaction. But I think at a biochemical level, physiological level, I think we all react to the beans and the legumes and the nuts and the seeds and the grains. It might not be detectable. You may not have a joint pain flare up or a gut flare up or a skin flare up, but bet you your CRP is going to elevate when you eat improperly prepared corn or legumes.
And think about a world in which, first, none of these technologies that I'm talking about are outside the realms of something you can do in your own house. In fact, if there's a food that you can't properly, not that you're going to, but if there's a food that you don't have the ability to make in your own home, then it shouldn't be in your diet, right? If it requires people in lab coats and $1 million machines and all these other kinds of things, it shouldn't be in your diet. But think about if you took all the different things, didn't change anything else. Let's just say you had whatever your diet is right now, you properly processed all the components of your diet to maximize safety, nutrient density, and bioavailability. Think about the transformations that would happen when they start building on one another incrementally over days and weeks and months and years. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't change something. I don't know what everybody's diet is anyhow, but if you just did that alone, what you would be able to gain from that, from a nutritional and health perspective. And the modern industrial food system isn't doing it for you. I mean, it's one of the reasons why you have to take it into your own hands and do it and do it in your home, or find some sort of a small producer that's doing it somewhere.
So would you say that if there was enough public pushback and enough public demand, that Kellogg's could process corn properly, and then cornflakes would be much less bad, and perhaps not part of a proper human diet yet, but at least less bad? Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I've never actually thought about that. But if the big food processors actually processed the food properly, which doesn't just mean grinding it up and adding some preservatives and colors and sugar and salt, if they actually process the corn properly, then it would be much less inflammatory for the entire population. It would probably have less effect on the hormones of the population, which many of these plant foods have a negative effect on hormones, and it's probably because it wasn't processed properly. That's fascinating. I've never thought of that. You've pointed me to another rabbit hole I'm about to dive into.
Let me put it in other terms. The diet that you and I advocate the most for has a certain audience, and that audience is people that are made up of an open mind, that are ready to take that information, or have gotten to the point with something in their life or their health where they need to make a dramatic change, and started to make a change in this direction and are seeing amazing results. That's fine. But the majority of the population, even if what you and I are advocating is 100% right, and I think it is, because that's what we're doing, but are not in a place to make an overnight switch into what we're saying. 100%. So what do we do? Like in that meantime, what do we do with the other 98% of people that want to achieve better health, but are still going to eat their croissants or eat their cookies or do whatever? And really, to be honest, what we're doing here with the Modern Sunday's Kitchen, we are taking our mission is to take familiar food and make it as safe and nourishing as it can possibly be. And that way, we have entire families coming in and they're eating. Look, we have a sourdough bakery. We do. We have a sourdough bakery. We are very strict about what we do and how we do it. But I'm not advocating eating bread. But if you're going to eat bread and you're going to serve it to your kids, this is the bread that they should be eating. And that's sort of where we're standing on this. And it really is making a difference.
Oh, and I think inflammatory wise, absolutely, that's going to make a difference. Does the carbohydrate count still matter? I think for many people it does, sure. But for young metabolically healthy people, corn, wheat prepared properly the ancestral way to open the nutrition and to beat down the inflammatory process is probably fine for them to eat in moderation and to enjoy. It's probably not a big deal at all. I could talk to you all day about this, but people may have other stuff to do. I want to close. I want to talk about modern hunter-gatherer societies. And now there are many influencers in the proper human diet movement who have actually visited. I know you visited with multiple different hunter-gatherer groups of people, aka tribes. And I want to ask you how, because a lot of people say this is what the Hadza do, so therefore that is the proper human diet, that's what we should do. And I've got problems with that hypothesis, and I want to know what you think about. You visited, tell us a few of the tribes that you visited, what you've learned, and what do you think that we can just mimic what modern hunter-gatherers do? And that's a proper human diet.
So we've been, actually, I personally have been, but more importantly, the entire family has been to a lot of these different remote places, living and working with indigenous and traditional groups. We've been with the Samburu warriors in Kenya. We've been with the Hadza in Tanzania. I spent a lot of time in South America, in Bolivia with Aymara Indians and in Quechua Indians in Peru, up in the Andes, and all over the world. And I can honestly tell you, number one of the issues with directly taking what somebody else is doing, especially from this sort of ancestral way, and directly transplanting it on us, it doesn't work for a couple of reasons. Now, I am passionate about doing this kind of research for several reasons. One is I really do want to preserve these dying traditions because they're incredibly important, not only from a nutritional perspective, but from just a social and ethnographic perspective. I mean, this is humans doing incredibly amazing things that just should be preserved, but also because there's a lot of inspiration and information we can draw that we can help influence the way that we approach food today, not directly putting it. So there's several reasons. So one great example is we were the Samburu warriors. We're drinking raw blood and milk straight from the cows, which is literally the mainstay of their diet. And I will say that is the healthiest population I have ever been around across the world. I would consider it to be them. And they drink blood and milk every day. And for 6 months out of the year, the men and the boys, that's all they have. One of the issues, right, is that I'm here in Maryland and raw milk is illegal and blood is almost impossible to get. So there's social and legal reasons that it's difficult to do. But another reason is because no matter how long some of these groups took me days, years to make inroads to get there, but literally days of treacherous travel to get there, physically get there. They've all been impacted by the modern industrial food system at some level.
100%. And
even where that might not be as important is that they've all been impacted through hundreds of years of historic change. Like the hunter-gatherers thousands of years ago were living in the most pristine, beautiful areas, teeming with game, beautiful. And then it's the same areas where rivers are flowing through and trade can happen, and cities started popping up, and places were taken for agricultural land. So these hunter-gatherers have been pushed to the margins. They're not living in the same incredible environments that they were living in hundreds or thousands of years ago.
And that's the part that most people don't understand. I think for many people in the United States, think about Native Americans.
Right.
It would be like going to an Apache reservation or a Cherokee reservation and saying, these guys, they've lived here for at least 20,000 years. We should eat their diet. Yeah, if you want to have metabolic disease, eat their diet. Yeah, because that is they have been pushed to the most marginal land. Mm-hmm. And in my reading, and I'm by no means an archaeologist or an anthropologist, but I'm an avid reader and fan. And I have yet to read about a hunter-gatherer society that has not been pushed to marginal land. They are not on their ancestral hunting grounds. They are not where they would choose to be. And so that's why I think in many cases, when like our good friend Paul Saladino talks about the Hadza and how they do this and this and this, I don't think that mirrors in any way their actual ancestral diets, because they've been pushed to terrible, worthless marginal land. Multiple times in many cases, they've been moved more than once. So basically every time we discover a new mineral resource, or we need this river for transport, or we need this farm to grow, we just round them up at the point of a gun and push them further out into the marginal land. And so I think I agree with you. I think what they are doing with what they've been given is miraculous. Like the ingenuity is off the scale. It's Elon Musk quality, right? But that is not their ancestral diets.
There is not a major, I don't know of a major city in the world that's not sitting on top of earlier historic manifestations of that city, that's not sitting on top of multiple prehistoric sites. I mean, that those places, Philadelphia is a great example. We've done a lot of historic archaeology in Philadelphia, and underneath all of it is a bunch of prehistoric sites because it was in a perfect location on right. So they've been pushed and changed. And so they've been impacted by this movement, impacted by lack of resources, impacted because Coca-Cola or Snickers bars have obviously made it into all these places as well. But there still is incredible information to derive from them, but that information has to be filtered. And so I also believe, I think this is really important for us to understand as well. This is all a big experiment, right? It's an unintentional experiment. Millions of years ago, we started making stone tools and started making fire, and then hunting and fermenting and doing all of this nixtamalizing and doing all of these different things are changing our diets. Our bodies are changing in response to these changing diets. Things are happening and we're doing all of these different things. But I truly don't believe, and this is, I want to make sure we leave this on a very positive note, because just like with most of my conversations about and diets in the past, diets today, we have this really pretty rosy picture of diets in the past, and then we have this miserable, dread picture of diets today. I don't believe the perfect human diet has yet been created. I do believe that most of the diets of the past the diets and the approaches that literally built us as humans is the foundation that we should all be going back to start to understand what that perfect human diet is. But a lot of people, especially when the paleo diet started and they draw the strict line, everything before 12,000 years ago is good and everything since then is bad. I don't believe that either. I do think there's been a lot of advancements in understanding of food and ways of dealing with food that have happened in the past 12,000 years. And if the diet of the future is one that we can really get over ourselves, use ancestral diets, a true understanding of our ancestral dietary past as a foundation, and then seek to create the most nourishing, ethical, and sustainable diet, it's going to be a different diet than we have right now, or a different diet than we had even in the past. But it's one that I'm confident that if we put our minds to it, we should be able to create this incredibly nourishing, sustainable, and ethical diet of the future. And I'm confident that it's one that it is focused on animal-based diet. It's focused on regenerative farming and focused on using a complete nose-to-tail approach to animals. And where plants are involved in that diet, they must be processed properly.
I love that idea. This is Dr. Bill Schindler. This is his book, Eat Like a Human. It's at any bookstore. There is an Audible version for those of you with ADHD like me who have to listen to a book while you do something else. If you have not read or listened to this book, it's on my top 5 all-time books that you need to read or listen to. Dr. Schindler, it's been an honor. I really feel like there needs to be a part 2 to this conversation because we barely scratched the surface. If you're watching this, if you think there needs to be a part 2, tell me in the comments. Thank you, Dr. Schindler. I'm going to put links to everything we talked about down in the show notes, to your website, etc., so people can check you out. You are a fount of information and wisdom, and I cannot wait to host you here on the farm and use some ancient technology to get some ancient nutrition. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.